Israel needs Christianity to thrive in our political infrastructure and in the belief system of ordinary Americans. Because as long as Christians believe in the second coming of Yeshua, then that will further its colonial agenda of a greater Israel. Christians have a hard time separating God from the Bible. To them, it's God's word, all of it. So when Netanyahu calls the Palestinians the Amalekites, it's a dog whistle to Christians and to Christian leaders that God is fine with committing a genocide, because to them, it reflects the Bible. Christian values in the Bible are a tool of colonialism. Just look at Africa, look at South America, look at Southeast Asia. Christianity has done far more harm than good, and that is self-evident. Christianity itself is a colonized religion. That's literally what Paul the Apostle did. He hijacked the idea of how to liberate yourself from an oppressive government through Christ consciousness and packaged it with the same composition as paganism. Catholicism is literally a plagiarized version of Roman paganism, and every denomination of Christianity is made up of the same substance. An example of how subtle the deception is when it comes to Christian imperialism. In Mark 16:15, Yeshua tells his disciples to go preach the good news to every creature. He that believes shall be saved. He that believes not shall be condemned. For centuries, Christians have thought this to mean they have a duty to be a missionary to some degree, because they don't understand what they're reading, because they don't have a historical context for it. It's just passed down misinformation. The misinterpretation serves a colonial agenda, so why investigate it? This is what he really meant. In Matthew 23:24, Yeshua laments over Jerusalem and warned them of the ramifications of not recognizing the moment they're in, the fork in the road. Either listen to your Messiah and the message that he's delivering, or reap total destruction. The Jews and the Jewish leadership chose the latter, and obviously they gave him up to be crucified. And as he was weeping over Jerusalem, he says, "Your house is left unto you desolate," in Matthew 23:28. And he says, talking about their temple, "Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." He was talking about the end times, the destruction of Jerusalem, the apocalypse. Well, how do we know that? In Matthew 24:3, his disciples ask him, "When shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and the end of the age?" In the context of the destruction of the temple. So his second coming wasn't the physical representation of his persona. His second coming was his words. His words were going to be fulfilled. They were coming back in the form of destruction upon Jerusalem. And he tells them straight up, "This generation shall not pass until all these things are fulfilled." Sure enough, a generation later, in fact, it was 33 years later, just so they remember it was him that prophesied it, the Jews start a war with Rome in 66 AD, and in 70 AD, Rome burns down their temple. That was the second coming, and everything that he had prophesied in Matthew 24 was fulfilled. We know this through a second-hand eyewitness named Josephus, who was a historian and documented all that occurred during the Jewish war, and it matched up completely with Jesus' prophecy. So in 70 AD, Rome laid a siege to Jerusalem with 50 to 70,000 troops and surrounded its walls. And this was during the time of the Passover. Back in those days, the Jewish diaspora would pilgrimage to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover feast. So hundreds of thousands of Jews, possibly millions of Jews, are stuck in the city while it's under siege, and they could not get out. This is why Yeshua in Matthew 24:20 says, "Pray that your flight be not in the winter or on the Sabbath day, for then shall be great tribulations. And except those days be shortened, there shall no flesh be saved." Those days were shortened because it only lasted for 6 months. The war began in 66 AD, and in 70 AD, Jerusalem was besieged for 6 months. 666, the mark of the beast. Who is the beast? Rome. So if you were caught in Jerusalem during those days, you were marked for death. This is why after his resurrection, he tells his disciples to go into the Jewish diaspora and tell them the good news. He that believes shall be saved, and he that believes not shall be condemned. So salvation has nothing to do with you, and it never did. You don't need to be saved. Salvation had everything to do with professing to the Jews the good news or the gospel, that you no longer needed to observe the Sabbath or end up in Jerusalem during the Passover if you believed in the Christ consciousness. If they didn't believe in the Christ consciousness, they would end up going to Jerusalem to observe the feast, where they would end up with the mark of the beast or the mark of death. To put the nail in the coffin to validate everything that I am saying, the diaspora of the Jews before the time of Christ began when the first temple was destroyed by the Assyrians or Babylonians. So the Jews adopted different cultures and different tongues. So how were the disciples going to communicate with them and tell them about the good news or the gospel? Disciples would have to learn their tongue, but learning their tongue would take time, and they didn't have much time, because undoing religious strongholds takes a generation. After his resurrection in Acts 1:8, Yeshua tells his disciples to wait in Jerusalem in an upper room, which is spiritually symbolic of raising their vibration to a higher level, where they would receive, wait for it, a spiritual gift of speaking in different languages, which has nothing to do with babbling gibberish in the evangelical churches. Well, how do we know they were speaking in different languages? Well, in Acts 2:8, the diaspora of the Jews were in Jerusalem celebrating the Passover, and they heard the disciples speaking in their own languages. The book of Revelation is not about some future advent. The book of Revelation is about the past. It's about the Jewish war that took place in 66 AD. It's about the siege that took place in 70 AD. It's about the destruction of the temple, and it's about the destruction of Rome. The only second coming of Christ that we're ever going to experience is the awakening of the Christ consciousness amongst the collective.